Book 2, Chapter 35 of Resurrection. The procession was such a long one that the carts with the luggage and the weak started only when those in front were already out of sight. When the last of the carts moved, Nekhludoff got into the trap that stood waiting for him, and told the isvostchik to catch up to the prisoners in front, so that he could see if he knew any of the men in the gang, and then try and find out Maslova among the women, and ask her if she had received the things he sent. It was very hot, and a cloud of dust that was raised by the 1,000 trampling feet stood all the time over the gang that was moving down the middle of the street. The prisoners were walking quickly, and the slow-going isvostchik's horse was some time in catching them up. Row upon row they passed, those strange and terrible-looking creatures, none of whom Nekhludoff knew. On they went, all dressed alike, moving 1,000 feet all shod alike, swinging their free arms as if to keep up their spirits. There were so many of them, they all looked so much alike, and they were all placed in such unusual, peculiar circumstances, that they seemed to Nekhludoff to be not men, but some sort of strange and terrible creatures. This impression passed when he recognized in the crowd of convicts the murderer Fedorov, and among the exiles Okhotin the wit, and another tramp who had appealed to him for assistance. Almost all the prisoners turned and looked at the trap that was passing them, and at the gentleman inside. Fedorov tossed his head backwards, as a sign that he had recognized Nekhludoff. Okhotin winked, but neither of them bowed, considering it not the thing. As soon as Nekhludoff came up to the women he saw Maslova. She was in the second row. The first in the row was a short-legged, black-eyed, hideous woman who had her cloak tucked up in her girdle. This was Khoroshavka. The next was a pregnant woman who dragged herself along with difficulty. The third was Maslova. She was carrying her sack on her shoulder and looked straight before her. Her face looked calm and determined. The fourth in the row was a young, lovely woman who was walking along briskly, dressed in a short cloak, her kerchief tied in peasant fashion. This was Theodosia. Nekhludoff got down and approached the women, meaning to ask Maslova if she had got the things he had sent her, and how she was feeling, but the convoy sergeant, who was walking on that side, noticed him at once and ran towards him. "You must not do that, sir. It is against the regulations to approach the gang," shouted the sergeant as he came up. But when he recognized Nekhludoff, everyone in the prison knew Nekhludoff, the sergeant raised his fingers to his cap, and stopping in front of Nekhludoff said, "Not now. Wait till we get to the railway station. Here it is not allowed. Don't lag behind. March!" he shouted to the convicts, and putting on a brisk air, he ran back to his place at a trot, in spite of the heat and the elegant new boots on his feet. Nekhludoff went on to the pavement and told the isvostchik to follow him, himself walking so as to keep the convicts in sight. Wherever the gang passed it attracted attention mixed with horror and compassion. Those who drove past leaned out of the vehicles and followed the prisoners with their eyes. Those on foot stopped and looked with fear and surprise at the terrible sight. Some came up and gave alms to the prisoners. The alms were received by the convoy. Some, as if they were hypnotized, followed the gang, but then stopped, shook their heads, and followed the prisoners only with their eyes. Everywhere the people came out of the gates and doors, and called others to come out too, or leaned out of the windows looking, silent and immovable, at the frightful procession. At a crossroad a fine carriage was stopped by the gang. A fat coachman, with a shiny face and 2 rows of buttons on his back, sat on the box. A married couple sat facing the horses, the wife a pale thin woman, with a light-coloured bonnet on her head and a bright sunshade in her hand, the husband with a top hat and a well-cut, light-coloured overcoat. On the seat in front sat their children, a well-dressed little girl with loose fair hair and as fresh as a flower, who also held a bright parasol, and an 8-year-old boy with a long thin neck and sharp collarbones, a sailor hat with long ribbons on his head. The father was angrily scolding the coachman because he had not passed in front of the gang when he had a chance, and the mother frowned and half closed her eyes with a look of disgust, shielding herself from the dust and the sun with her silk sunshade, which she held close to her face. The fat coachman frowned angrily at the unjust rebukes of his master, who had himself given the order to drive along that street, and with difficulty held in the glossy black horses, foaming under their harness and impatient to go on. The policeman wished with all his soul to please the owner of the fine equipage by stopping the gang, yet felt that the dismal solemnity of the procession could not be broken even for so rich a gentleman. He only raised his fingers to his cap to show his respect for riches, and looked severely at the prisoners, as if promising in any case to protect the owners of the carriage from them. So the carriage had to wait till the whole of the procession had passed, and could only move on when the last of the carts, laden with sacks and prisoners, rattled by. The hysterical woman who had sat on one of the carts, and had grown calm, again began shrieking and sobbing when she saw the elegant carriage. Then the coachman tightened the reins with a slight touch, and the black trotters, their shoes ringing against the paving stones, drew the carriage, softly swaying on its rubber tires, towards the country house, where the husband, the wife, the girl, and the boy with the sharp collarbones were going to amuse themselves. Neither the father nor the mother gave the girl and boy any explanation of what they had seen, so that the children had themselves to find out the meaning of this curious sight. The girl, taking the expression of her father's and mother's faces into consideration, solved the problem by assuming that these people were quite another kind of men and women than her father and mother and their acquaintances, that they were bad people, and that they had therefore to be treated in the manner they were being treated. Therefore the girl felt nothing but fear, and was glad when she could no longer see those people. But the boy with the long thin neck, who looked at the procession of prisoners without taking his eyes off them, solved the question differently. He still knew, firmly and without any doubt, for he had it from God, that these people were just the same kind of people as he was, and like all other people, and therefore someone had done these people some wrong, something that ought not to have been done, and he was sorry for them, and felt no horror either of those who were shaved and chained, or of those who had shaved and chained them. And so the boy's lips pouted more and more, and he made greater and greater efforts not to cry, thinking it a shame to cry in such a case. End of Book 2, Chapter 35.
Book 2, Chapter 36 of Resurrection. Nekhludoff kept up with the quick pace of the convicts. Though lightly clothed, he felt dreadfully hot, and it was hard to breathe in the stifling, motionless, burning air filled with dust. When he had walked about a quarter of a mile, he again got into the trap, but it felt still hotter in the middle of the street. He tried to recall last night's conversation with his brother-in-law, but the recollections no longer excited him as they had done in the morning. They were dulled by the impressions made by the starting and procession of the gang, and chiefly by the intolerable heat. On the pavement, in the shade of some trees overhanging a fence, he saw two schoolboys standing over a kneeling man who sold ices. One of the boys was already sucking a pink spoon and enjoying his ices. The other was waiting for a glass that was being filled with something yellowish. "Where could I get a drink?" Nekhludoff asked, his Voskreséniye feeling an insurmountable desire for some refreshment. "There is a good eating-house close by," the Voskreséniye answered, and turning a corner, drove up to a door with a large signboard. The plump clerk, in a Russian shirt, who stood behind the counter, and the waiters in their once white clothing, who sat at the tables, there being hardly any customers, looked with curiosity at the unusual visitor, and offered him their services. Nekhludoff asked for a bottle of seltzer water, and sat down some way from the window at a small table covered with a dirty cloth. Two men sat at another table with tea things and a white bottle in front of them, mopping their foreheads and calculating something in a friendly manner. One of them was dark and bald, and had just such a border of hair at the back as Rahinsky. This sight again reminded Nekhludoff of yesterday's talk with his brother-in-law, and his wish to see him and Natalie. "I shall hardly be able to do it before the train starts," he thought. "I'd better write." He asked for paper, an envelope, and a stamp, and as he was sipping the cool, effervescent water, he considered what he should say, but his thoughts wandered, and he could not manage to compose a letter. "My dear Nathalie, I cannot go away with the heavy impression that yesterday's talk with your husband has left," he began. "What next? Shall I ask him to forgive me what I said yesterday? But I only said what I felt, and he will think that I am taking it back. Besides, this interference of his in my private matters. No, I cannot." And again he felt hatred rising in his heart towards that man so foreign to him. He folded the unfinished letter and put it in his pocket, paid, went out, and again got into the trap to catch up the gang. It had grown still hotter. The stones and the walls seemed to be breathing out hot air. The pavement seemed to scorch the feet, and Nekhludoff felt a burning sensation in his hand when he touched the lacquered splash guard of his trap. The horse was jogging along at a wary trot, beating the uneven dusty road monotonously with his hoofs. The isvostchik kept falling into a doze. Nekhludoff sat without thinking of anything. At the bottom of a street, in front of a large house, a group of people had collected, and a convoy soldier stood by. "What has happened?" Nekhludoff asked of a porter. "Something the matter with a convict." Nekhludoff got down and came up to the group. On the rough stones, where the pavement slanted down to the gutter, lay a broadly built, red-bearded, elderly convict, with his head lower than his feet, and very red in the face. He had a grey cloak and grey trousers on, and lay on his back with the palms of his freckled hands downwards, and at long intervals his broad, high chest heaved and he groaned, while his bloodshot eyes were fixed on the sky. By him stood a cross-looking policeman, a peddler, a postman, a clerk, an old woman with a parasol, and a short-haired boy with an empty basket. "They are weak, having been locked up in prison. They've got weak, and then they lead them through the most broiling heat," said the clerk, addressing Nekhludoff, who had just come up. "He'll die, most likely," said the woman with the parasol, in a doleful tone. "His shirt should be untied," said the postman. The policeman began, with his thick, trembling fingers, clumsily to untie the tapes that fastened the shirt round the red, sinewy neck. He was evidently excited and confused, but still thought it was necessary to address the crowd. "What have you collected here for? It is hot enough without your keeping the wind off." "They should have been examined by a doctor, and the weak ones left behind," said the clerk, showing off his knowledge at the law. The policeman, having undone the tapes of the shirt, rose and looked round. "Move on, I tell you. It is not your business, is it? What's there to stare at?" he said, and turned to Nekhludoff for sympathy, but not finding any in his face, he turned to the convoy soldier. But the soldier stood aside, examining the trodden-down heel of his boot, and was quite indifferent to the policeman's perplexity. "Those whose business it is don't care. Is it right to do men to death like this? A convict is a convict, but still he is a man." Indifferent voices were heard saying in the crowd, "Put his head up higher, and give him some water," said Nekhludoff. "Water has been sent for," said the policeman, and taking the prisoner under the arms, he with difficulty pulled his body a little higher up. "What's this gathering here?" said a decided authoritative voice, and a police officer, with a wonderfully clean, shiny blouse, and still more shiny top boots, came up to the assembled crowd. "Move on. No standing about here," he shouted to the crowd, before he knew what had attracted it. When he came near and saw the dying convict, he made a sign of approval with his head, just as if he had quite expected it, and turning to the policeman said, "How is this?" The policeman said that, as a gang of prisoners was passing, one of the convicts had fallen down, and the convoy officer had ordered him to be left behind. "Well, that's all right. He must be taken to the police station. Call an isvotchik." "A porter has gone for one," said the policeman, with his fingers raised to his cap. The shopman began something about the heat. "It is your business, eh? Move on," said the police officer, and looked so severely at him that the clerk was silenced. "He ought to have a little water," said Nekhludoff. The police officer looked severely at Nekhludoff also, but said nothing. When the porter thought a mug full of water, he told the policeman to offer some to the convict. The policeman raised the drooping head and tried to pour a little water down the mouth. But the prisoner could not swallow it, and it ran down his beard, wetting his jacket and his coarse, dirty linen shirt. "Pour it on his head," ordered the officer, and the policeman took off the pancake-shaped cap and poured the water over the red curls of the bald part of the prisoner's head. His eyes opened wide, as if in fear, but his position remained unchanged. Streams of dirt trickled down his dusty face, but the mouth continued to gasp in the same regular way, and his whole body shook. "And what's this? Take this one," said the police officer, pointing to Nekhludoff's isvotchik. "You there, drive up." "I am engaged," said isvotchik, dismally, and without looking up. "It is my isvotchik, but take him. I will pay you," said Nekhludoff, turning to the isvotchik. "Well, what are you waiting for?" shouted the officer. "Catch hold." The policeman, the porter, and the convoy soldier lifted the dying man and carried him to the trap, and put him on the seat, but he could not sit up. His head fell back, and the whole of his body glided off the seat. "Make him lie down," ordered the officer. "It is all right, your honor. I'll manage him like this," said the policeman, sitting down by the dying man, and clasping his strong right arm round the body under the arms. The convoy soldier lifted the stockingless feet in prison shoes and put them into the trap. The police officer looked around, and noticing the pancake-shaped hat of the convict, lifted it up and put it on the wet, drooping head. "Go on," he ordered. The isvotchik looked angrily around, shook his head, and, accompanied by the convoy soldier, drove back to the police station. The policeman, sitting behind the convict, kept dragging up the body that was continually sliding down from the seat, while the head swung from side to side. The convoy soldier, who was walking by the side of the trap, kept putting his legs in their place. Nekhludoff followed the trap. End of Book 2, Chapter 36. Recording by Chris Karan.